Love, Death, and Robots snuck up on me in 2019. I remember thinking after finishing Shapeshifters, Sonnie's Edge, and Beyond the Aquila Rift that this show had no business being as good as it was. And I am sure many of you probably thought the same thing as well. But aside from the obvious pull of jaw-dropping animation, Love, Death, and Robots is doing something really cool with short-form storytelling. But what exactly is going on a writing level to earn our interest? What is short-form storytelling and really Love, Death, and Robots doing to draw us in? And most importantly, how can we understand it so that we can write stories like this ourselves? Well, all that is what today's video is going to be about. And perhaps surprisingly, much of the show's success comes from managing equal parts storytelling and psychology. I figured that since I went into horrendous debt for a master's in psychology and have spent the better part of 7 years being a novel and manuscript editor, I could put the two together to pull back the curtain on Love, Death, and Robots and how the allures of its storytelling might be a bit different than what you have previously considered. So sit back, relax, and let's begin this long video by exploring the psychology of ambiguity.
Show me what you got, big boy.
One of the main drivers of interest in fiction is the unknown. This is why spoilers are the great taboo when it comes to storytelling. As soon as you know definitively what to expect, the tension and mystery can plummet. It's the allure of not knowing where or how a story will progress that contributes to our interest in it. This ambiguity is typically handled differently between long-form storytelling and short-form storytelling. A potential consumer of the fiction is given a sizable amount of information. The synopsis on the back of novels can be 3 to 5 paragraphs. Trailers for movies and other visual mediums can be minutes long, sometimes even revealing massive plot points. These glimpses into long-form storytelling are done to ensure a consumer that there is interesting content within worthy of their time. An example of this, though extreme, would be the Hobbs and Shaw trailer, which basically showed you the whole movie from beginning to end. The risk of this, of course, is that by revealing so much of what makes up long-form fiction, a potential consumer can be given enough information to perhaps realize the fiction isn't for them. Speaking personally, I love both The Conjuring 1 and 2. But the trailer for The Conjuring 3 showed me enough so that I pretty much have no interest in seeing what looks to be a cliché horror movie, but we'll have to see. Short-form storytelling works a bit differently though. Typically, a consumer is given very little information about the content of a short story. This is pretty easy to understand too. Since the length of the story is so small, the description has to be equally as brief, lest you ruin the ambiguity and tension of the narrative. This usually means that you will enter into a short story with much less certainty about the events than with traditional long-form fiction. To see how this directly relates to Love, Death, and Robots, just look at the Season 2 trailer. You only get glimpses of what is to come, never concrete information on anything. This heightened ambiguity and uncertainty in short-form storytelling creates the possibility for increased curiosity in a consumer. But that still is only half of what is going on here. Not only is Love, Death, and Robots short-form storytelling, it is in anthology format. Of course, this means each entry of fiction is distinct from the others, and this effectively creates a gambling-like scenario for a consumer. Since you never know what you are going to get, and there is always an option for a new, distinct point of interest to occur, you are pulled to watch the next episode even if the one you just finished disappointed you. This scenario really isn't viable for long-form storytelling because of the amount of time they demand from you. If you spent a whole hour, a whole season, or a whole book only to be disappointed, you probably wouldn't continue on with the next entry even if it was completely different. This was the exact problem some people ran into with the long-form anthology series Black Mirror. However, because Love, Death, and Robots anthology entries are short form, the show is built on a low-risk, high-reward investment structure. Putting in 11 minutes could net you a fantastic narrative experience. And if it doesn't, Oh well, it was only 11 minutes. Love, Death, and Robots is banking that on a psychological level, it can convince you that its short time commitment and varied entries make it worthy of your continued attention. It's set up to make you believe that an even better story is hidden around the corner, just one click away. The show is created with the idea that each of its entries has the possibility of satisfying you, but just to the right amount that you want to come back for more. And that actually transitions us to our second area of interest, the psychology of gratification.
It's just what I wanted.
Understanding the psychology of gratification is going to be a bit more complex than the psychology of ambiguity, because gratification, when you get down to it, is a battle. More specifically, it is a battle of economics, waged between the storyteller and the consumer. The spoils of said economic conflict are time and energy, the currencies of life. Everyone who has ever been born has had time and energy. The only kicker is that no one has any idea how much of both we actually have, so we become very judicious in how we choose to spend them. Everyone invests their time and energy differently. The battle arises by a storyteller fighting to convince a consumer that their fiction is worth investing time and energy into. The consumer then looks for any and every excuse to discontinue the fiction and more wisely invest their limited time and energy elsewhere. The battle is only won by the storyteller if they can gratify the consumer, if they can prove that the fiction they're providing is more valuable than the time and energy the consumer put in. But like, what the heck does that all even mean? Well, as I said, it's a bit complicated, but we can definitely work to break it down. Let's start our deep descent into understanding gratification by unpacking passive versus active fiction. Passive fictions are those stories which progress with minimal participation from the consumer. Passive fictions require very little to no energy to be invested by the consumer. Therefore, passive fictions are easier to stick with because the costs for consuming them are typically low. Examples of passive fictions are TV shows, movies, audiobooks, plays, etc. These are stories where, even if they're uninteresting, you can literally do nothing and simply wait for them to progress into something you are gratified by. One thing to note very quickly is that although passive versus active seems like a binary distinction, it's actually much more of a spectrum. Storytelling is art, and art is subjective, and a spectrum helps account for the nuances between types of fiction. With that said, further along the spectrum is more active fiction, storytelling that only progresses when a consumer invests energy, i.e. when you put in some sort of effort. This is the category that written fiction falls into. It's all there for you, you just have to produce the attention and energy to read through it. Due to this constant need of your own effort and energy to progress the story, written fictions are harder to stick with when they are unentertaining. And speaking of written fiction, I have 4 fantasy fiction books available on my website for about $6 each. You should check them out. Anyway, even further down the spectrum are highly interactive fictions like video games that require the consumer to make the story happen themselves. The consumer actively controls characters and quote-unquote creates the events of the narrative. The story literally does not exist until you make it so. Now, there is a whole lot of psychology that goes into the construction of video games and their narratives, but we will leave that for another video. What's important to know is that the more active a fiction becomes, the higher the level of energy investment is for the consumer, meaning the more costly it becomes for that person to continue on with the fiction if they are not being gratified. The next aspect that assists in understanding the psychology of gratification is length of the fiction. Now, there are 2 guidelines to understand concerning this. Number 1, the longer a fiction is, the more frequently it will need to gratify its consumers. If I create a TV series that is 8 seasons long, I can't just gratify my audience with interesting circumstances in the first 4 seasons and then do nothing else for the other 4. I must continuously be showing my audience that there are new and interesting things happening in the fiction, or else they will drop the fiction. That is the essence of guideline 1. Number 2 is that the longer a fiction is, the greater its final gratification is expected to be. To say this in another way, the bigger a story is, the more a consumer will want to see a payoff that is equally big. And guideline 2 simplistically comes back to time investment. If I have given a show 50 hours of my life, time that I will never get back, I want the culmination of that investment to be pretty substantial. But keep in mind, this also has the reverse effect, where if a short fiction has a disproportionately large payoff, a consumer feels even more gratified than they expected. This is why you will sometimes feel more moved or affected by a Pixar short film than an entire animated movie. And the last component to understanding the psychology of gratification, at least that we'll be talking about, is the style of the storytelling. While the substance of a fiction is always the focal point, it is not the only contributor to what can gratify a consumer. Sometimes the method in which a fiction is presented makes the time investment worth the while. If you've ever heard someone say they could gladly listen to Morgan Freeman read a phone book,
just listen to that rich molasses.
They are gratified by the style rather than the substance. One of my favorite videos on YouTube is literally just a woman talking about her white-hot rage for people who microwave fish at work. But it's the method in how she tells it that makes it so dang interesting.
This is just a memo or a letter, if you will, to people who microwave or cook fish at work. Fuck you. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Fuck you, fuck your mama, fuck your daddy, fuck the horse you rode in on, fuck everybody who loves you, who cares about you, who has ever supported you in your life, who has become a part of making you the person that you are today.
This is the exact thing that happens frequently with written fiction. Sometimes you will just come across an author who writes their story so uniquely that the style itself becomes entertaining. A movie like Memento would generally be considered pretty straightforward if not for the stylistic choice of telling the movie backwards. Avatar is just a story of natives fighting against colonization, something that we've all surely seen before, but it was the level of stylistic fidelity in its presentation that assisted in it being so alluring. Content-wise, games like Abzu or Journey are pretty minimalistic, but it's the style of the graphics that thoroughly gratify us. Now, the reason that I detailed all of this information is to understand how Love, Death, and Robots exists as a fiction, and how it makes the most of its attributes to gratify our time and energy investments. First off, Love, Death, and Robots is television, a medium of storytelling that will progress without much energy from the consumer. Love, Death, and Robots is passive, meaning that a consumer does not need to invest much into it for the possibility of a great return. That then leads us into its length, where we can consider the aforementioned guidelines. The longer a fiction is, the more frequently it will need to gratify its consumers. Well, since episodes of Love, Death, and Robots are so short, the fiction doesn't need to worry about constantly gratifying a consumer. In each episode, there is only enough time to establish 1 or 2 points of interest, and then the episode dives into those with the remaining time. There is no space for long exposition or world building, or even much downtime. Due to this, a consumer is more likely to feel properly gratified because the whole story revolved around something interesting. This is one of the strengths of short-form storytelling. Next is Guideline 2. The longer a fiction is, the greater its final gratification is expected to be. Again though, Love, Death, and Robots is short-form storytelling, meaning that consumers are not generally looking for a huge payoff in the end. These are short stories to be enjoyed in small bites. But the advantage swings in the other direction as well. Some episodes have fantastic payoff, and due to the short length of the storytelling, the gratification seems even greater due to the small time investment. And lastly, even if the substance of an episode does not bring gratification, there is a likelihood that the style of the animation will. Each episode is animated in a different way, but one aspect that they all share is their strikingly high quality. Speaking as a consumer myself, some of these episodes are downright gorgeous, and even though I wasn't fully swept away by their stories, I simply loved watching them. All these elements come together to put Love, Death, and Robots in a very good position to gratify us and earn our continued investment. And while this was just the very tip of the iceberg when it comes to unpacking gratification, I hope it shows how storytellers have to be just as concerned with getting into the minds of their audience as they are with creating the stories themselves. But there is still one more aspect that is key to understanding how Love, Death, and Robots interacts with its consumers as a fiction, and that is through the psychology of content. Whether a consumer knows it or not, each person is predisposed to liking certain types of fiction over others. And I'm not just talking about genres of fiction, I mean the content, storylines, pacing, conflict, and everything else. It is the task of the storyteller to get into the heads of their consumers and create stories that people want to see. Well, within Love, Death, and Robots, there are 3 different archetypes of stories, at least from what I can tell. For the purposes of this video, we will call these 3 archetypes the traditional, the experiential, and the twist. Each of these archetypes attract different consumers, and the anthology format allows for a whole lot of manipulation for how they are presented. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves though, let's start by defining these archetypes. We'll lead with the traditional. The name probably already gives you a hint at what this narrative archetype entails. This is short form storytelling in its quote-unquote purest form. It's basically just a condensed version of the longer tried and true narrative execution you are already used to. You have the introduction of your main characters, the struggle they are involved in, the rising action, the conflict, and then the resolution. A typical 3-act structure. If you found yourself really interested in episodes like Shapeshifters, Lucky 13, or Snow in the Desert, they fall into this traditional archetype category. Next comes the experiential episode archetypes, which break away from the mold that you may be used to with typical narrative construction. Rather than being concerned with establishing conflict and setting and character backstories, these episodes are more concerned with the journey, theme, and tone of the narrative. This is where the animation can truly shine, because these experiential episodes can use their visuals to assist in taking you for an emotional ride. For those of you who are more into symbolism, creativity, and aesthetic ideology, episodes like Ice Age, Helping Hand, The Drowned Giant, and Fish Night act more like visual poetry than traditional fiction and probably piqued your interest. Because of the lack of a rigid structure, these short stories are much more interpretive, and the core message is really left for you to make what you want of it. Lastly, we can discuss the twist archetype. These are episodes in which a piece of information is provided in the closing moments of the narrative that alters or informs the consumer's perception of previous material. And yes, I recognize that was a mouthful, so an easier way to say this would be when reveal changes the way you think about an episode. If you are a consumer who likes subversion of expectations and surprise endings, you might have liked episodes such as 3 Robots, Suits, All Through the House, or Beyond the Aquila Rift. These are stories that only click into place once their ending is known, causing a later rewatch to be wildly different. But now that we've defined and discussed these categories, you might be thinking, some of the episodes don't fit smoothly into one archetype or another. And bravo, because you would be completely correct. That is what is so cool about Love, Death, and Robots as a show. It is willing to cross these narrative lines to give us mixes and fusions of storytelling. Zima Blue has elements of both the experiential and twist archetypes. Sonnie'S Edge is traditional and twist. Life Hutch and Ice are traditional and experiential. And an episode like The Witness is a stunning combination of all 3, which is probably why it won the Primetime Emmy. The archetypes are not so much distinct points, but another spectrum that allows for fictions to fall anywhere in between them. And these different categories of storytelling resonate differently with each individual consumer. Every person who interacts with a fiction is different, meaning every person will want and expect different things. What the anthology format of Love, Death, and Robots enables it to do is experiment episode by episode with its content. When the Yogurt Took Over is about as experiential as you can get, and Pop Squad is about as traditional as you can get. But automated customer service sits somewhere in between. And for many people, they are not going to like automated customer service for that very reason. It does not align with what they want to see. But at the end of the day, that is the risk being run with having such varied short stories. Love, Death, and Robots isn't a show where you can watch one episode and decide that it's not for you. Because the episodes are only tangentially linked by a love, a death, or a robot, they can end up being whatever. And even looking past the archetypes, the variation continues by considering some episodes are romance, comedy, horror, or commentary. Properly utilizing the psychology of content calls for a storyteller to have a creator's mind and a consumer's mind. Only when you think like a consumer can you give them what they want. And in some cases, consumers don't even consciously know what they want, but still rightfully expect to be entertained anyway. Remember, it's your job as the storyteller to convince a consumer to give over their time and energy. And that requires understanding their psychology to give them something they want to see. Love, Death, and Robots uses ambiguity, gratification, and its content to set up shop in the heads of people like you and me. And hopefully, you may now be a bit more knowledgeable on how to do such a task yourself. Anyway, thank you all for watching all the way until the end. If you like what you heard, like, comment, and subscribe. If you really want to be a homie, support through Patreon or check out some of my books and check out the second channel right here. Links will be in the description. As always, it was a pleasure, and I will talk to you all again soon.